This is your Chevrolet dealer's inflation fighter special pickup. No standard equipment taken off, no costly extras to buy. Just an extra good deal.
There's something unique about trucks from the golden age of American truck manufacturing. I'm talking about the 1970s when automakers focused on durability and performance.
There she goes, a 3/4-ton Chevy pickup with available 350 V8, automatic transmission, 410 axle, dual exhaust, oil coolers, and full-time four-wheel drive.
An era when trucks were built like tanks and not fragile art pieces. So, what is it about these vintage trucks that makes them so irresistible to restorers, and why were they built like tanks? Let's find out together. To understand why 1970s trucks were built like doomsday bunkers, we need to talk about the America they were built for. Back then, everybody needed trucks, but not just any type. The farmers, ranchers, and construction workers who were the main buyers of these machines were specific about what they wanted. A proper workhorse that could take a beating day in, day out. That's because every breakdown bears serious consequences. Lost income, missed deadlines, and potential disputes with clients. In other words, reliability wasn't an option. It was an obligation that buyers expected from pickup trucks and, by extension, the manufacturers. Now that brings us to the first question of this section. How do you build a reliable truck? Well, as engineers of that era understood it, and I'm pretty sure their modern colleagues would agree, it all starts from the frame. See, back in the 1970s, pickup trucks were built literally like metal robots on wheels. They featured full ladder frames carved from heavyweight steel that would make modern trucks feel like paper planes. To further put some context behind that claim, let's talk about the Chevrolet C/K series for a second. Manufactured by General Motors between 1960 and the early 2000s, this fleet of trucks carried frames with multiple crossmembers. And in case you're wondering, that arrangement wasn't just for fancy. It was adopted to create a rigid, box-like structure that distributed stress across the entire chassis. Beyond frames and chassis, many other components on these trucks were also made from steel. This includes body and bed panels, door skins, fenders, and basically every external part you could think of. By doing that, automakers were able to design trucks that are rugged and strong enough to take on extra weight beyond their rated payload. Also, the simplicity of the structural design meant that repairs were straightforward. A cracked frame or panel could easily be repaired and welded by any competent welder. As you can see from this clip, patch panels, basic welding skills, and a touch of paint were all it took to restore the worst dents on this damaged 1970 Chevy C10 truck. That's not to say trucks from that era are perfect, though. Most are actually overweight because manufacturers were obsessed with steel. And at some point, it felt like they were over-engineering things. But Americans didn't complain. As long as the trucks served their purpose, they were more than happy to keep buying them. All through the early 1970s, demand for trucks remained healthy. More than 3.5 million units sold between 1970 and 1971 alone. But then came the moment that changed everything. The element of surprise is one of the most important weapons in warfare. And on the afternoon of October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria deployed it to devastating effect against Israel. With lightning speed and sheer brutality, the Arab nations overran IDF positions at the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights. The audacity of the assault caused great concern both in Israel and even far away in Washington. But the ease with which it was executed was even more worrying, especially after it was confirmed that the Soviets were resupplying Egypt and Syria with arms. So what did the United States do? They threw their full weight behind Israel with a $2.2 billion emergency military aid package. That's massive money, even by today's standards, and it changed the tide of the war in favor of Israel. The IDF quickly regained lost ground and launched a deadly assault of their own. The Egyptians and Syrians knew they stood no chance against a re-energized Israeli force backed by America's superior weapons. So, for the second time in this bloodthirsty war, they sought external help. But this time, their plea wasn't directed to the Soviets. It was directed to other Arab nations across the Middle East. And And that's where things got really interesting for truck owners in the United States. Of course, the Arabs didn't have munitions, but they had crude oil, the lifeblood of the global economy and the one thing that American trucks from the 1970s loved the most. So, to express support for Egypt and Syria, the Arab members of OPEC banned oil shipments to the United States. And the impact was, of course, far-reaching. Oil prices jumped from roughly $3 per barrel to nearly $12. In the US, motorists watched in horror as gasoline prices climbed from 38 cents per gallon to nearly 80 cents. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. People waited hours just to fill their tanks, and some stations ran dry completely. Households who previously spent $30 a week on fuel were now spending $60 or more. And for small businesses operating fleets of trucks, fuel costs suddenly became their largest expense. Not labor, not spare parts. And let's be honest, as a business owner, when you're faced with such a crisis, the sensible thing to do is to seek alternatives, and that's exactly what happened. Americans abandoned gas-guzzling automobiles for smaller Japanese imports, which offered better fuel economy. The embargo was eventually lifted in March 1974, but spoiler alert, the damage was already done. Fuel prices never returned to pre-crisis levels. Demand for American trucks continued to plunge, and manufacturers were beginning to feel the heat. Without wasting time, all the top engineers and executives across GM, Ford, and Chrysler returned to the drawing board. They began to reimagine the way they built trucks, and in doing so, they discovered something crucial. To build fuel-efficient trucks, they needed to do away with steel and embrace aluminum as the primary manufacturing material. But come to think of it, what exactly is the difference between both materials? In fairness to the engineers who designed those 1970s trucks, they had pretty good reasons for utilizing steel as much as they did. I mean, everyone knows steel is strong and durable. It offers excellent protection in high-impact collisions. And as one of the most affordable raw materials on Earth, it's quite affordable compared to other alternatives. Plus, it's straightforward to work with. Anybody with basic welding skills and equipment could repair steel. Watch how easy it is to sand the body panel of this square-body Chevy C from the 70s. It's absolutely flawless, but here's the thing, steel is heavier than aluminum. For context, if you put two tables side by side, one entirely made from steel and the other crafted from aluminum, the steel desk will be 2.5 times heavier. And that's not a small difference, especially in truck manufacturing. Because that extra weight reduces the available payload capacity, you're basically hauling around the weight of the truck itself before you even load anything in the bed. And worst of all, it decreases fuel efficiency, which, if you remember from earlier in this video, was exactly the problem automakers were trying to solve during and after the oil crisis. And by extension, that's what forced them to adopt aluminum. Unlike steel, aluminum is lightweight, which makes it the perfect material for manufacturing fuel-efficient trucks. And as a bonus, it's flexible for carving creative shapes and body lines that are aesthetically pleasing to the eyes. You could do things with aluminum that would have been a nightmare to stamp in steel, but of course it has its own limitations as well. See, aluminium is expensive to manufacture and repair, significantly more expensive actually. To cure the tiniest dents on aluminum, you need specialized equipment and trained technicians who know what they're doing. And that costs money. With that said, the biggest difference between steel and aluminum is something we haven't even mentioned yet: rust. The limitations of steel, particularly its tendency to rust over time, was well known to automakers in the 1970s. And as the visionaries that they were, they put measures in place to prevent it. One of the ways in which they did this was by applying simple paint or sealants to protect the steel. Ideally, this seemed like the perfect solution. And look, in most cases it actually worked. For a while at least. But when it failed, it made things 10 times worse. You see, car manufacturers use paint and sealant as a barrier to shield steel from elements that cause rust like oxygen and moisture. But here's the issue. Even though they look smooth, these coatings have microscopic holes and cracks. And you know what happens when water encounters holes. It seeps through and gets trapped between the steel and coating. And that is where the real damage happens. Because now you've created the perfect environment for corrosion. You've got moisture sitting directly against bare steel, sealed in by the very coating that was supposed to protect it. It can't evaporate. It can't drain away. It just sits there, slowly eating through the metal from the inside out. The irony in all of this is that the same material that automakers thought made 1970s trucks indestructible is the same thing that made them rust away. Now that leads us to the all-important question. If 1970s trucks are actually prone to rust, why then are restorers so obsessed with them? And how come the market for restored 1970s pickups remains strong even after all these years? While this question has been asked countless times, the answer is surprisingly simple. American trucks made in the 1970s have good bones. So when you strip them down, you typically find frames that are still structurally sound, a body that isn't entirely rusted, and mechanical components that either work or can be rebuilt. And that makes all the difference. As a restorer, when you know that's what you're going to find behind the dented shell of a damaged 1970s truck, it's hard to look away. But here's where it gets even better. The simplicity of trucks made in that era makes restoration easier. Way easier than modern trucks. You don't need a computer science degree to detect faults or carry out repairs. A mechanically inclined person with decent tools can do most of the work themselves. And I'm not just talking about oil changes. I mean complex jobs like engine rebuilds or transmission overhauls. Good luck doing that on a 2024 truck with a dozen electronic modules that need reprogramming every time you disconnect the battery. Now, in addition to all that practical stuff, 1970s trucks have this strong character and presence that modern vehicles just can't replicate. There's an honesty to their design, a straightforward purposefulness that appeals to people who value performance over fake vents or chrome accents that serve no purpose. And you might not believe it, but there's a financial incentive to all of this. Well-restored 1970s trucks are climbing in value as people recognize their quality and as the number of restorable examples dwindles. A good restoration can be a solid investment, unlike a new truck that depreciates the moment you drive it off the lot. Now, to be clear, I am the first one to admit that today's trucks are way smarter than their predecessors. They have better fuel economy, more power, and all of the good stuff that make people pay top dollar to own them. But those from the 70s are the real survivors. They remind us that sometimes value isn't just about what's new. It's about what can stand the test of rust, moisture, and time. And that's definitely worth preserving, just like restorers did to this abandoned classic Land Rover from the 1980s.